Hello, welcome to the Creepy House diorama. This one, you might find it hard to believe, doesn't include any Loot Studios figures, or any figures at all. And the inspiration for it came when I was playing with Midjourney. For those that don't know, that's the AI program that's making amazing illustrations from a simple description. Although I understand it has severe difficulties in knowing how many fingers people have. But I thought I'd give it a go. And the first thing that popped into my mind was Creepy House in the Woods. And this is the results. I must admit, I was quite blown away and instantly had to build it. So here we are. I ended up with about 20 versions, so I'm going to cherry pick features from all of them. And I particularly like this tree, so that's got to stay. And this one has a round tower, so got to have that, although I don't know how I'm going to build that yet. For the base, I'm going to glue some XPS foam onto a thin piece of plywood, and I'm planning a curved backdrop that I will paint a bit of a scene extension onto it. And basically, as usual, I'm going to have minimal planning, just see how it evolves. I need to build up the base a bit, as the house is on top of a little mound. Plus I need to raise it up some, as the reference illustrations show lots of roots and vines growing out of it, which I rather like. First I roughly take the corners off with the standing knife. And then I get to use my little hot wire sculpting tool for the first time and shape it some more. It's going to be very rough dirt terrain, so I don't need to be too precious how I do this. It's now time to break out the cricket. I did consider cutting this by hand, but I needed some real precision, as each layer of this base the house sits on is fractionally smaller than the one before, so any inaccuracies in the cutting would show up like a sore thumb. Oh, I'm using some 1mm construction card here, and after the glue dried I covered all outside surfaces with PVA glue to give it some waterproofing. I think the key to an interesting diorama is detail, lots of details. So I'm going to add some floor joists underneath the base plate, and they'll just be made out of coffee stirrers. A feature of the reference photo I really liked was it looked like the house was almost growing out of the ground. So I'm going to simulate that with putting these random piles in the ground, all at funny angles, and I will intersperse that with roots. Haven't quite decided yet whether the roots should be real roots out of the garden or I'll make my own from wire. The big tree that's going to be in there will definitely be made out of wire, so I'll think on that. After struggling with the base to try and work out the extent of the piles, it suddenly occurred to me I've still got the piece of card that the bases were cut out of, and it was far easier to use that. I decided to go with creating the main roots myself out of wire, mainly because I thought it'd be a good practice for the main tree. I've never done anything like this before. I'm using florist wire as it's extremely supple and bendy, and just trying different ways to wind it together in a rooty sort of shape. The good thing about this practice is it doesn't want to be neat. I want knobbly roots, so the aim is to not wind the wire perfectly, plus get lots of kinks here and there. The wire will just be the inner core to the roots. The outside will be milliput. I'm using the slightly more expensive fine milliput here, but I could easily get away with using the standard. I just didn't have any. It's a little bit fiddly covering the wire with milliput, and if you use it when it's just been mixed, it tends to be very sticky. so if you're not impatient like me, it's a good idea to wait 5-10 minutes before sculpting. After I have the main chunky roots in place, I want to give the whole area a more creepy look, so I'm going to crisscross the area with sort of tendrils. Not sure if that's the right word, but I don't want realistic roots. I want something a bit more, well, creepy. So these sort of tendrils, I'm going to make them out of long, thin, rolled out milliput, going to a fine point, and I let them drape all over the area. They often say less is more, but I think in the case of these tendrils, more is more. So I'm filling up the whole area with as many as I can, but you may have noticed there's an area in the bottom left where the big tree goes, so I'm avoiding that area. At some arbitrary point I decided I had enough roots and tentacle-like things, so an overnight wait for the milliput to thoroughly dry and go rock hard. I need to add some texture and protect the foam. So I first mix up some watered down PVA glue and black paint, black acrylic paint, and give the whole thing several coats, and on the last coat, long before it's dried, I sprinkle my favourite chinchilla sand and add that all over the wet PVA glue. After everything has been thoroughly dried, which when it's this saturated does take quite a long time, I give the whole thing a spray of Army Painter's colour primer. As you can see, it's black, and then ready for dry brushing. The whole diorama is going to be almost black and white, just with slight hints of colour. And for the roots area, that colour will be just a little bit brown, but highly desaturated. And after initial pass of dry brushing with the darkest colour I'm going to use, I add more white to the mix and go over again, just concentrating where I think the highlights are. I keep going this way until the final pass, which is almost pure white, and only a very few areas would get that. All the hard work is done by the texture, which was created by the chinchilla sand, so it really is extremely easy. Right, now the fun part, building the house itself. I've decided to build it out of foam board, as it stays extremely rigid, easy to cut, very light, and I've never built anything with it before, so good time to give it a go. I started the whole process by planning out every wall on the computer, printing out that map and lightly tacking it to the foam board. Now I had this great plan to do a long strip of walls, complete with the corners in one go, and where a corner happens, cutting a V into the foam board, the back of the foam board, bending it into place, gluing it, job done. That turned out a bit of a nightmare. And although I've persevered with the first sections, when I got to the upper floor, I changed tact and just cut it into separate little pieces, overlapping and gluing. It turned out much simpler and more accurate, as the lower floor did go a bit wonky. I didn't mind the wonkiness, as I think that adds to the house. This is not a pristine house, it's meant to be old and creepy. As you can see, this method is getting very messy, and I'm starting to question my life choices. As I built the sections, I thought it a good idea to add the doors and the windows as I went along, as this made the whole structure more solid. The doors and windows were all 3D modelled before I started the project and 3D printed, all very straightforward. I've never bothered showing the 3D modelling process, as there are a million YouTube channels out there devoted to that sort of thing, doing a better job than I could do, so the 3D printing parts will magically just appear. Now I've got all the individual sections put together, it's time to attach them to the base, which is extremely straightforward. Just glue in position and add a little weight on top until the glue is thoroughly dried. Now I wasn't massively concerned with the state and quality of the walls I've just built, as I knew I always intended to cover it all up with some sort of cladding. and I ummed and ahed over bricks or slats, and eventually I went with slats. Now with the slats, I could have just put large sheets over the whole thing, large sheets of plastic art that is, scored the lines in and called it done. But I'm a glutton for punishment, so I decided to cut all the slats out individually and glue them on individually. But it does give you a nice exaggerated overlap that adds lots of texture and detail to the model, which helps enormously when you come to dry brush the paint on. It catches all the edges. Right, now on to the next floor. This doesn't have the awkward curve of the ground floor, so no need to break out the Cricut. I can just cut this by hand. I'm going with 2 layers of the 2mm construction card, which I think is enough. It's quite tough, as can be seen by how many cuts of the scalpel it needs. I made a slight mistake on cutting the openings in the middle, forgetting that the lower floors had balconies at the back, but it had no structural importance, so I just filled it in later. I glued the 2 layers together and grabbed what I could to hand to weight it all down, which was quite important as the card, when wet, really wants to bend. The upper floor walls went much quicker than the lower after I decided to do it in smaller sections and not try the silly idea of notching the back out of the foam board and trying to bend it round. They're the little holes I had to fill up. It's fairly out of sight, and once painted up you never notice it was there, so not bothered. The last thing to do for this level is making the tower. At one point I was going to do a round tower, but then I thought a square one would suit it better and be a lot easier to make. Although I will chamfer the corners at the top part to make it a bit of an octagon, as I think that will make the pointy roof part of it look better. I thought a nice added detail is some rafters underneath that overhang that goes above the front door. Right, there's no putting it off. I've now got to do the slats, lots of slats, although I must admit I'm okay with these repetitive, takes hours, little jobs. I just need something to listen to take my mind off the task and keep going. Now the part I've really been waiting for, gluing on the railings. I was almost tempted to put them in before doing the slats, but that would have been a very silly idea. A quick spray with black primer so it unifies everything and you can really see what it looks like. And now onto the roof, so we're getting there. Everything's been carefully worked out on the computer with all the angles I need to cut, and then it's a big fingers crossed I actually did it right. But the first thing down is the base of the roof, so a bit of cutting out, a bit of adjusting around the tower, then cutting a duplicate and gluing the 2 together like the previous floor. As a slight departure from the rest of the building, the core of the roof is going to be made entirely of the construction card, as the thickness of the foam ball would make it much more difficult to work out the shapes of everything, and especially the little dormers that are going to go all over it. They're so small that it'd be ridiculous in the foam board. The fit of these pieces I would consider a near miss. There's little gaps and a few bits poking out, but well within tolerances, as I can trim it up a little bit and the whole thing's going to get covered in tiles anyway, so no need to be too precious with it. With the little pointy roof on the tower constructed, that's the main roof completed. I just need to get the dormers and windows on. These dormers are a little bit fiddly to construct 2mm card, but I sort of got there in the end. And as to positioning them on the roof, I largely just used guesswork, just eyeballed it, going by the old saying, if it looks right, it is right. With the roof tiles, I had the plan to do it in long strips with just partial lines cut to represent the individual tiles. But in the plastic art I used, it made the whole thing into a curve that you really could not straighten out. So I made the decision to just cut them all individually, which will have the benefit of making the whole thing more random, which is good. But the big downside is considerably more work. One of the big hassles of gluing on all the individual tiles is not so much the gluing of the tiles, but cutting the tiles individually like this. No idea how many tiles I ended up with, but I wouldn't be surprised if it was thousands, or at least high hundreds. I'm sure there's a gadget out there to speed up the task, but I didn't have it. So it's just the trusty old scalpel. But like the slats, if you've got something good to listen to, it's almost therapeutic. And watching it develop is very satisfying. So I carry on, cutting and gluing, and hopefully all those edges will really catch the dry brush and make the whole roof pop. So I think it really will be worth all the effort. Phew, onto the little tower roof part, which must mean I'm nearly finished. And that also means getting close to doing the big tree. So I've got to decide exactly how I'm going to do that. One thing I've also been giving a lot of thought to as I've been building the model is how I'm going to do the steps leading up to the house. And what I've come up with is a very simple method of just using my favourite coffee stirrers with a little spacer and building a partial spiral leading up to it and a few loose steps across all the roots and stuff. And I'm just going to keep building it up until it reaches the required height, and hopefully it'll all fit in nicely. If I want to glue the steps in place, I'm going to have the ground floor of the house in place and also glued. So I don't just want to rely on the two touching surfaces, so I drill some holes through and get some skewers in place as well, just to give it a bit of extra security. I've also taken the opportunity to drill one of the holes all the way through to the baseboard, as I have decided to add some simple lighting, so I need somewhere for the wire to come out, and this seems like the best time to do it. Right, the part I've certainly been looking forward to, dry brushing some colour into the building. This will let me know whether all that work on the slats and tiles will actually pay off. The house is set at night time with a lot of moonlight, so I'm going to dry brush over the black various levels of bluey grey, starting dark with an overall dry brush and then slowly adding white as I dry brush more into the highlights only. Basically what I did on the ground, except more blue. Here I'm dry brushing the steps with the same sort of colour as the roots and soil. I want a definite transition between the ground area and the building. I settled on the final position of the steps, mostly the three loose ones at the bottom, and glued them in place. Now some fun. Been looking forward to this. I get to make the large tree. It's going to be more or less the same as making the roots, just on the larger scale. And I've got myself this copper wire, which I believe is made for speakers of some sort. And all I need to do is strip off the plastic coating, and I've got this large bundle of very fine copper wire inside. I've cut them all to twice the height of the tree, as I'll be folding in half and using the loop as a handle to twist the trunk. And later that loop can be cut and turned into the roots, as I want this tree to be a little in the air on its roots.
So the process is quite straightforward. Grab a nice bundle of the wires, twist them up to form a major branch, and as you go up you keep dividing and twisting until you run out of wire, all the while giving some thought to the overall shape of the tree. And the copper is very bendy and largely stays where it's put, so it's quite straightforward bending it into shape. And also remember that tree limbs are rarely dead straight. They tend to kink in various ways, especially the tree I want, as bent and gnarly trees are more suited to the creepy look. One thing you've got to be careful of is not to stab yourself on the tiny wire ends. If you catch the right angle, it will go through your skin. I know, I did it a couple of times. If I was making a full tree in glorious leaf, I would spend a lot of time with the ends of the branches where the wires go down to 1 or 2 left, and then probably glue something like sea foam on the ends to complete the look. But here it's a gnarly old dead tree, so I'll be just trimming off those finer ends as they're not necessary here, which is a bit fortunate, as I should imagine that's where a large amount of the work would be put, maybe next time. The heaviest part of the tree, where the main trunk meets the largest branches, is a little bit too wobbly for my liking, so I've taken some florist wire and just wrapped it around in a few places just to tie everything together. With the loop at the root end cut in half, I can basically do a mini version of the tree to represent the roots, but these do want to be short and stubby, and I've got to bend them just right to follow the contours of the ground. To make the whole thing very solid and stable and give it a surface to carve in some details, some texture, I'm cladding the whole thing in milliput. Well, maybe just the thicker branches, the fine little twigs at the ends I will miss out and just leave it as bare metal. As I go, I'm testing it in the position it's going to end up in, just to make sure everything fits and the roots conform to the ground. At some point the milliput's going to go rock hard and it'll be fixed in position, so this part is very important. Here I'm putting the tree in its final position and then add in some little tendrils to drape over the edge. I'll leave them to go hard, but hopefully not stick to the base, as I still need the tree to be removable at this stage. But hopefully it has a really nice little locked in position that will eventually be glued. Now I need to tidy up the ends. So a bit more twisting, a bit more covering in milliput, and then some pruning, which is a little bit hard to do, as I keep thinking, well, if I want that bit, and sticking it back on is tricky. But I just need to remember I'm going for a dead, creepy, gnarly old tree. To add to the creepy look, I've been rolling up some milliput worms and draping those all round the trunk and the main branches, basically to mimic what I'd done with the ground. With the tree basically finished and the milliput left to go rock hard overnight, I cover the trunk and the thicker branches in PVA glue and then sprinkle chinchilla sand over everything, shaking off the excess. This is to give it a texture very similar to the ground cover, and then I'll be dry brushing it in exactly the same way as the ground cover so it all unifies. It's always amazing what looks flat and boring suddenly comes to life with a few minutes worth of dry brushing. Got to be my favourite technique of all. One of the things I've got to finish up is adding glass to the windows. The windows that aren't actually glued into the building are the ones that go in the roof, as I've no access to the back of those windows once glued in place. The main building I can still get to the back of the windows, even though a few places it might be a bit tricky. But I ummed and ahed for a long time thinking about what I'm going to use for the glass, and I had quite a few sheets of overhead projection film that I used in the Gothic Angel diorama. So I printed out some stained glass pattern and a couple of other colours. Wasn't entirely sure what I was going to use when I printed, but I think I'm mostly going to use the stained glass and shoved the plane at the back of the diorama where no one's going to see. I no longer need access to the tower, so I can finally glue the pointy roof on. For a while now I've had this little offcut of very thin MDF that I completely soaked in water and let dry into a curved shape, which surprisingly worked out quite successful. So now I'm just cutting it to the right shape and gluing my pre-printed backdrop onto it. The glue I'm using is just some spray mount, and I printed the backdrop onto pretty thick cartridge paper, so smoothing it onto the wooden background was very easy and no possibility of bubbles. I got myself a little 9-volt battery box and some 9-volt LEDs that are pre-soldered, and all I had to do was get the LEDs through the base, carve a little channel to the outside and join the wires up. Couldn't be simpler, except I've never soldered anything ever before and I've seen it done 1,000 times. How hard can it be? Well, I should have done a little bit of practice, as it ended up a right bodge job, but the electricity still flowed, so it'll do for now. Sometime in the near future I'll do a bit of practicing and redo it, but for now it'll do. To mount the backboard, I drilled some holes in it and cut off the ends to some wooden skewers, just to add a belt and braces to gluing the backboard to the diorama. Might not have needed the skewers as it's under no strain, but a little bit of security can't help. It's a good time as any to glue the tree in place. The very last thing I've got to do is dry brush some pure white where I think the moonlight will just kiss the top of the roofline. Phew, this one took a bit of time to complete. I hope it was worth the wait. I promise the next one will be much quicker, as it's got a real deadline, and that's because I'm going to try and infiltrate a painting exhibition. I'm going to smuggle in a diorama in a picture frame to see if it gets past the selectors and gets hung in an exhibition. Please subscribe and hit that notification button to find out if I'm successful. Thank you for watching this video, I really appreciate it. Goodbye.